You don't belong here. Old man, people like you don't own banks. People like you barely own the clothes on your back. Those words, sharp and humiliating, came from a teller behind the counter of First Union Bank in Atlanta, and they landed with the force of a slap across the room. The voice was loud enough that customers turned, some with curiosity, others already smiling, waiting to see the humiliation unfold. Another teller chimed in, shaking his head with a smirk. "Go on, sir. Take that ragged sack and move along. This is a place of business, not a shelter for beggars. The Matthews family built this bank and they've owned it for 70 years. Laughter burst out, cruel, mocking, spreading across the polished marble floor of the lobby. A few customers even chuckled, looking the old man up and down, amused at the very idea that he would dare to stand here. Friends, before I tell you how this story unfolds, I want to pause for just a moment. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, hit that like button and subscribe, so you never miss these stories of justice and truth. Now let us return to Atlanta, to that crowded branch, to the moment when an old man dared to speak a truth everyone else had long forgotten. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind of day when tempers were short and the lines stretched across the lobby. The hum of printers and the steady click of keyboards blended with the chatter of customers waiting for deposits and loans. And then the glass doors opened. An old black man stepped inside, his body bent slightly from age but still steady, his hair silver and tangled, his shoes worn thin, his coat patched in more than one place. Over one shoulder he carried a faded canvas sack, frayed at the edges, the kind of bag no one in that lobby would have considered valuable. The moment he appeared, whispers rose. A woman in a pearl necklace pulled her handbag close to her side. A man in a suit rolled his eyes, and two tellers exchanged grins that said everything without words. They thought he was out of place, a drifter, maybe confused, maybe lost. But he did not look lost. His eyes, dark and calm, fixed on the center of the lobby as if he knew exactly where he was meant to stand. He walked slowly, the sack swaying lightly against his shoulder. And when he reached the center, he stopped. He lowered the sack to the marble floor, the sound of its weight landing echoing strangely in the restless lobby. For a moment he was silent. Then he straightened his back, lifted his chin, and spoke in a voice steady but clear. "This bank belongs to me." The words cut through the noise, freezing the room for a heartbeat. Then came the laughter, louder, harsher, filling every corner. A customer clapped sarcastically. Another pulled out his phone, already filming, whispering, "This is too good. Some old man thinks he owns the bank." Behind the counter, the young tellers covered their mouths, stifling giggles, while their manager, Richard Harlan, emerged from his office, annoyed that his quiet Friday had been disturbed. Richard was a man in his 40s, his suit crisp, his tie perfect, his hair slicked back. He looked at the old man the way a landlord looks at an unwanted tenant, with disdain hidden under a thin layer of professional courtesy. "Sir," he said, his voice sharp but calm enough to carry authority, "let's not cause a scene. This bank has been owned and operated by the Matthews family since the 1950s. I don't know what you think you're doing here, but you are mistaken. Take your things and leave before this becomes embarrassing." The old man, Elijah Carter, did not flinch. His gaze held steady, unshaken by the stares, unbroken by the laughter. He lifted one hand, resting it gently on the sack at his feet, and said again, slower this time, "I built this bank. I am the founder, and I have come to take back what was stolen." The guard stepped forward then, Mark Donovan, tall and broad-shouldered, his reputation well known in the branch as a man who liked to throw his weight around. His hand hovered near the gun holster on his hip as he barked, "That's enough. Old man, you're leaving. One way or another. Don't test me." His words were sharp, and for the first time a hush fell, because even the customers could feel the tension shift. Elijah looked at him with an expression that was calm, almost sorrowful, and replied, "Guns and threats don't scare me. I have seen worse than you. I have faced men with torches and ropes. I have faced a world that told me I had no right to dream. But I dreamed anyway, and I built this place with my own hands." His voice, soft but firm, carried across the room like the sound of a bell. Then, without another word, he bent down, his fingers old but steady, and untied the string on the sack. People leaned in, curiosity mingling with disbelief. The sack opened, and he drew out a leather ledger, thick and worn. Its cover cracked, but the gold-embossed letters still faintly visible. Community Trust Bank, 1952. He held it high, and the lobby fell silent. Alongside it, he laid out faded certificates, yellowed papers, and even bundles of currency stamped with logos no one in that room had seen in decades. The air changed. The laughter stopped. Customers whispered, stunned, their phones capturing every second. Jessica Miller, a teller who had been laughing only moments earlier, stared at the ledger with wide eyes, her smirk gone, her face pale. Elijah's voice rose again, resonant and steady. "My name is Elijah Carter. I founded this bank in 1952 with my own sweat, my own money, my own dream. John Matthews was my partner. But when he could not accept that a black man could own and lead a bank in the South, he betrayed me. They forged documents. They erased my name. They stole my life's work. And for 70 years, you all have lived in the lie they created." His words hung heavy in the silence. The customers who had mocked him looked away, ashamed. The staff who had laughed found themselves frozen, their arrogance collapsing into disbelief. The guard shifted uneasily, loosening his grip on the holster. Even Richard, so confident just minutes before, looked pale, beads of sweat on his forehead. No one dared to laugh now. The man they had mocked, the man they thought was nothing, stood in the center of the lobby, holding proof in his hand. The truth had walked into their bank, carried in a sack that everyone had dismissed as worthless. And though the battle was only beginning, though the storm ahead would shake the Matthews family and the institution they controlled, one thing was already certain. On that Friday afternoon in Atlanta, the laughter died, the arrogance faded, and history, long buried, began to speak again. The air inside the bank had turned heavy, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap. And in that stillness, the voice of Elijah Carter rose once again, louder, stronger, and more deliberate than before. "This bank belongs to me." He had said it once already, but now the words carried a different weight, backed by the ledger in his hands, backed by the trembling pieces of history laid bare on the polished marble floor. And as he spoke, every corner of the room seemed to absorb the sound, pressing it against the hearts of everyone who had gathered to mock him only minutes earlier. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, their laughter replaced by whispers that sounded more like confessions. One woman whispered to her husband, "He sounds like he means it," while another man who had been smirking earlier now stood with his phone raised high, streaming live, muttering, "Folks, this might not be a joke after all." The bank manager, Richard Harlan, forced a smile that looked more like a grimace, his polished shoes clicking against the marble as he stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his position but betraying a crack of unease. "Mr. Carter, if that is indeed your name, you are disturbing this institution and you must leave immediately. You are confusing our customers and wasting their time. I will not tolerate any more of this nonsense." But Elijah did not step back, his eyes locked on Richard, his voice calm yet unyielding. "You call it nonsense because you are afraid of the truth. afraid of what happens when lies can no longer hide behind your walls of marble and glass. I built this place. I was the founder. And when they stole it, they thought they had buried me. But they were wrong. I am still here. His words rang out like a sermon, each sentence striking the listeners with the rhythm of conviction. And slowly, the crowd began to lean in, no longer scoffing, no longer laughing, but listening. The security chief, Mark Donovan, unwilling to surrender his authority, stepped closer, his broad shoulders blocking part of the view, his hand still grazing the pistol holster at his hip, his jaw tight, his voice raised in a bark. "Enough, old man. Nobody believes your story. You're here to scam. You probably dug that ledger out of a junkyard. Put it down now and leave while you still can." His words dripped with contempt, but there was something else in them too, something shakier, the kind of doubt that creeps in when anger no longer feels solid. Elijah turned his gaze on him, steady, sharp, and unafraid, his voice low but every syllable cutting through the air. "Young man, I have faced men far more dangerous than you. I have seen torches in the night. I have seen ropes dangled before my eyes. I have heard judges tell me that my skin was proof of my incompetence. And yet I lived. I endured. And I carried this proof on my back for more than 70 years. Do not mistake these old hands for weakness. Do not mistake my years of silence for surrender. I am here today because I will not die erased." The lobby grew tense again, the weight of his declaration hanging over everyone. Behind the counter, Jessica Miller, the young teller who had laughed at him earlier, found her throat tightening, her hands frozen above the keyboard she had pretended to type on. She looked at the ledger, at the yellow documents scattered near the sack, at the ink that still bore the faint but undeniable mark of age, and something inside her shifted. She whispered, more to herself than anyone, "What if he's telling the truth?" But Richard heard her, snapped his head in her direction, and hissed sharply, "Enough, Jessica! You don't know what you're talking about." Yet his voice betrayed him, too quick, too sharp, the sound of a man rattled by evidence he could not explain away. Elijah raised the ledger high again, opening it to the first page, his trembling finger pointing to a signature, faded but legible. "Here," he said, his voice like iron. "Elijah Carter, co-founder, alongside John Matthews, the very man whose family claims this bank as their empire today. Here lies the beginning. Here lies the truth. In my own hand, I poured my youth, my savings, my sweat into these walls, and because I was a black man in the South in 1952, they stole it from me. They forged, they lied, and they erased my name. But you cannot erase a man forever. The truth lives longer than lies." Gasps spread across the lobby. Customers exchanged looks of disbelief, mixed with shame. A woman who had earlier pulled her purse close now whispered a prayer under her breath, as if seeking forgiveness for the way she had judged him on sight. A man near the front muttered, "Lord, if this is real, this changes everything." Phones streamed, the comment sections filling with fire emojis, shocked faces, questions about justice, about history, about truth buried too long. The lobby of First Union Bank was no longer a bank. It had become a courtroom. It had become a church. It had become a theater of revelation. Richard Harlan, desperate to regain control, raised his hands and spoke louder, his words tripping over themselves. "Even if those papers are real, even if they say what you claim, it does not matter. The Matthews family has owned this bank for generations. The law is on their side. You are wasting your breath and these people's time." But his voice shook, the kind of shake a man cannot hide when the ground beneath him begins to crack. Elijah snapped the ledger shut with a sharp clap that echoed, and his eyes blazed with a lifetime of pain and defiance. "The law never heard me, Richard. The law silenced me. The law erased me. But today you will not silence me. Today, everyone in this room, everyone watching, will know that Elijah Carter was here, that Elijah Carter built what you now stand on. You call me nothing, but I am the foundation you have walked on for 70 years. The words hit like hammer blows. Jessica Miller felt her chest tighten, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Customers who had come for nothing more than a routine deposit now stood as witnesses to something far larger than a transaction. Even Mark Donovan, still gripping his holster, seemed to falter, his chest heaving as though the calm strength of this old man had punctured his armor of arrogance. A young man in line whispered, "He doesn't sound crazy. He sounds like a man who's been waiting his whole life for this moment." And indeed, that is what he was. The room felt different now. The mockery gone, the arrogance stripped away. Elijah Carter, frail in body but unbroken in spirit, stood before them with a truth no one could easily deny. His shocking declaration had taken the laughter out of their throats and replaced it with silence, with awe, with the uneasy knowledge that history, long buried, was rising in front of their eyes, and though no verdict had yet been given, though the fight ahead would be fierce. On that Friday afternoon in Atlanta, every man, woman, and child in that lobby understood that they were standing in the presence of something undeniable. The storm had broken, the reckoning had begun, and the old man with the sack had declared war on 70 years of lies. The hush in the lobby was so deep you could hear the faint hum of the lights above. Every breath heavy, every eye locked on the old canvas sack resting at Elijah Carter's feet. The same sack they had mocked when he walked in. The same sack they had dismissed as nothing but a beggar's burden. But now it had become the center of gravity, the object that seemed to hold the fate of the entire room, and perhaps the fate of the bank itself. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah bent down, his knees stiff with age but steady with purpose, and untied the flap once more, his gnarled fingers pulling the string loose as the crowd leaned forward, their phones raised higher, their whispers filling the air like the rustling of leaves before a storm. From inside, he pulled more than the ledger, more than the bundles of currency. He pulled out envelopes wrapped in oilskin, preserved through decades, tied carefully with faded red ribbon. And when he set them on the table near the customer service desk, the sound of paper meeting wood was like a drum beat. He opened the first envelope, his hand shaking only slightly, and drew out letters, typed on old letterhead, the logo of Community Trust Bank still clear though yellowed with time. He held them high, his voice calm but cutting. "Here are the letters of incorporation, signed in 1952 by the state of Georgia, listing me as majority shareholder with 40% ownership, John Matthews with 30, and 2 smaller investors holding the rest. My money, my sweat, my dream started this institution. These papers were filed, stamped, recorded, and then stolen from me." Gasps rippled through the room. A man in the back who had been recording whispered into his phone, "He's got incorporation papers. This is no scam. This is the real deal." Elijah laid the papers flat on the table, then reached into the sack again, pulling out another bundle wrapped in wax paper, and as he unwrapped it, everyone saw the glint of metal seals, the old embossed marks of notaries and state offices. "These," Elijah said, raising them one by one, "are the loan documents, the original capital agreements, proof that I invested $100,000 in 1952, money earned from years of farming, years of hard work, money I saved when nobody thought a black man could save a dime, money that today would be worth more than $1.1 million. Do not tell me I did not build this place. Do not tell me I am nothing." His voice cracked with emotion, and some in the crowd shifted uneasily, guilt gnawing at them for having laughed. The bank manager, Richard Harlan, stepped closer, his face pale, sweat shining under the fluorescent lights, his hands twitching as he reached out. "These could be forgeries. Old man, anyone could have printed these. Anyone could have typed these." but his voice was hollow. The desperation of a man clinging to denial as proof piled higher and higher in front of him. Elijah did not even look at him. Instead, he pulled one final item from the sack, wrapped in cloth, bound with twine. He unwrapped it slowly, like a man unveiling a relic from a tomb, and inside was a thick, leather notebook, handwritten entries covering the pages in careful script, his own handwriting from decades past, recording deposits, withdrawals, meetings, the building of a dream. He flipped it open, his finger tracing the ink, and held it up. This is my journal, written in my own hand. Every day I spent building Community Trust Bank, every deal I made, every promise I kept. Here are the minutes of the first meeting. Here are the signatures of the first account holders, farmers, teachers, black families who had never before been welcomed in a bank. And here. He flipped to another page, his voice tightening. Here are the notes of the day they betrayed me, the day John Matthews told me to my face that this bank would never carry the name of a black man. He told me I should know my place. That was the day they forced me out, and that was the day I swore I would never let the truth die. The silence was crushing. A young woman in the crowd whispered, "He wrote it all down," her voice trembling. Phones streamed live, comments exploding, thousands of viewers now watching from across the country. Mark Donovan, the guard, took another step forward, his hand still near his holster, his face flushed with anger. "This is all lies. This is a performance," he barked, his voice loud but hollow. "Documents, journals, it's all fake. He's here to stir trouble." But his words sounded weaker than ever, drowned out by the rising murmur of customers who had seen enough to know there was truth in the old man's eyes. Jessica Miller, the teller who had laughed earlier, suddenly stepped forward, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the faded bills from the table, running her fingers over the old Chase logo stamped on it. Her eyes wide. "This is real," she whispered, but her voice carried through the room. She turned to Elijah, her face flushed with shame. "I believe you, sir." That moment broke the dam. Another teller, Ethan Brooks, who had sneered only moments before, now stepped forward too, picking up one of the incorporation papers, his face red, his voice halting. I mocked you, but this is real. I'm sorry." One by one, employees began to move, picking up documents, touching the paper, feeling the weight of history in their hands. Each gesture was a silent apology, a silent declaration that they could no longer hide behind laughter. Customers began murmuring too, some nodding, some shaking their heads in disbelief but no longer mocking. Richard Harlan looked around, panic flashing in his eyes, as the ground he stood on seemed to crumble. "Stop this," he shouted. "Stop touching those papers. Stop this madness." But his voice was drowned by the sound of whispers turning into words, words turning into conviction, conviction turning into the realization that they were standing in the presence of truth. Elijah looked around the room, his eyes wet but steady, his voice trembling with both pain and triumph. "For 70 years, I carried this sack. They called me a fool. They called me a beggar. But inside this sack, I carried the truth. And today, you see it. Today, you cannot laugh it away. You cannot erase me again." His words hung in the air, and no one dared to respond. The sack, once ridiculed, had revealed its secrets, and those secrets were heavier than gold. The weight of the old man's words pressed down on everyone in the lobby, his documents scattered across the polished counter, his journal lying open like a wound that had never healed. And yet what came next was even heavier. For Elijah Carter, with his voice steady but thick with emotion, began to tell the story of how everything was taken from him, and every sentence was a knife cutting through the illusions of the bank's history. He spoke of 1952, when he and John Matthews stood together as partners, when two men shook hands on a dream, one black, one white, vowing to build a community bank that would serve farmers, factory workers, teachers, and small business owners who had been ignored by the big city institutions. Elijah had invested $100,000, his life savings earned from years of sweat, selling crops, repairing tractors, saving every dollar with his wife's careful hands managing the books. "We dreamed of something better," he said, his voice quivering. "A place where a black family could open a savings account without being laughed at. A place where their loan applications weren't stamped denied before they were even read. That was my vision, and for a while, it was real." His eyes darkened, his breath catching as the next word spilled out. But John Matthews couldn't live with the truth that a black man was his equal. He listened to whispers from powerful men in Atlanta, men who told him a Negro banker would ruin the institution's reputation, men who promised him wealth if he cut me out. So he did. They forged signatures. They created transfer papers I never signed. They bribed court clerks to lose my filings, and when I fought, when I brought evidence to the courthouse, they called me delusional. They called me dangerous. They called me a liar. One judge, God help him, even looked me in the eye and said, "Mr. Carter, you should know your place. Banking is not for men like you." The words made the room stiffen, jaws tighten, eyes dart nervously. For this was not just a story. This was a mirror held up to the past, showing them what their parents or grandparents had once accepted as normal. Elijah's voice grew stronger, rising like a preacher in a pulpit. "They erased me from the records. They scrubbed my name from the ledgers. And when the newspapers wrote about the grand opening of the new bank, they gave the credit to John Matthews and his partners. My wife wept as she read it. My children asked me why the world refused to see me, and I had no answer except this: that power and prejudice walk hand in hand. They pushed me into the shadows, and for decades I lived with the pain of knowing I had built something that bore another man's name. While the Matthews family grew rich, my family struggled. My wife died never seeing justice. My children left Georgia to escape the shame, and I remained here, carrying this sack, keeping every proof, waiting for the day the truth would speak louder than the lies." His hands trembled as he pointed to the pile of papers, the money, the journal, and the faded incorporation letters. "This is not just paper. This is my life. This is the truth they tried to bury with me." The room was so quiet now that even the skeptical faces softened. Even the smirks had turned to silence. A woman whispered through tears, "Lord, have mercy. What this man endured." Another man muttered, "If this is true, the Matthews family built their empire on theft." Richard Harlan, the manager, was pale as chalk, his lips trembling, his body rigid as he tried to maintain control. He barked, "None of this changes the fact that the Matthews family is the rightful owner. This is ancient history, irrelevant. The law settled it decades ago." But his voice rang hollow, for everyone in the room could see the fear in his eyes, the terror of a man realizing that the ground beneath him was crumbling. Elijah fixed his gaze on Richard, his voice sharp and unwavering. "You speak of law. But what law was it when I was denied a voice? What law was it when the courts dismissed my evidence because of my skin? What law was it when they stripped me of my life's work and handed it to thieves? That was not law. That was corruption dressed up in a robe. And now, the truth has returned. And no matter what name sits above the door, this place was built on my back." Customers began to shift, many pulling out their phones, some already streaming live to Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, across the country. People were watching an old man peel back the cover of history and expose the rot beneath. Comments poured in. "This is unbelievable. How could they hide this for so long? Justice for Elijah." The tension in the room was unbearable. Security guard Mark Donovan. His jaw clenched, tried once again to reassert control, stepping forward, his voice booming. "That's enough, old man. You can tell your sob story somewhere else. But this is a bank, not a courtroom, and I'll have you removed if you keep this up." But his words only made him look smaller, angrier, weaker. Because the truth was bigger now, bigger than his threats, bigger than the polished marble walls. Then came the most chilling moment. Elijah bent down again, pulling from the sack one last envelope, sealed in wax, untouched for decades. He held it high and said, "This is the deed to the original property, signed in my name, purchased in 1951. With money traced to my accounts, they buried it. They rewrote the records, but I kept the proof." Gasps filled the air, people pressing closer, phones capturing every angle. Richard staggered back, his knees buckling, whispering, "This can't be. This can't be," as though repeating it would make it true. Elijah's voice softened, but it was steady, strong. A man who had carried pain so long it had turned into steel. "They buried me, but I lived. They erased me, but I endured. They thought time would silence me, but the truth never dies." The room, once filled with mockery and laughter, was now a courtroom of conscience. Every customer a juror, every employee a witness, every phone a recorder of history being corrected. The buried past had come roaring back to life, and no amount of denial could put it back in the ground. And in that moment, the people realized that they were not simply witnessing the story of one man, but the unveiling of a wound in America's own history, one that could no longer be ignored. The tension in the lobby thickened like smoke, the weight of the old documents and Elijah's words pressing down until it felt as though the walls themselves were straining to contain the truth. And then, as if unable to bear the pressure any longer, the eruption came, first in the furious voice of Mark Donovan, the guard, his hand slamming against his holster with a loud crack that made customers flinch, his voice booming across the marble floor. "I've had enough of this circus. This old man is a fraud, a liar, and if management won't act, then I will, because I won't let some drifter tear down the reputation of this bank." His face was red, his jaw clenched so tightly a vein bulged at his neck, his whole body vibrating with anger that seemed less about protecting the bank and more about defending his pride. And in that moment, the room split in two, some customers backing away in fear, others standing their ground with their phones up, unwilling to miss a single second of what might become a historic confrontation. Richard Harlan, the manager, staggered to his feet from behind the counter, his face pale, his voice cracking but desperate. "Mark, calm down. Don't do anything stupid. This is bigger than us." But his words fell flat because it was already clear he had lost control. The authority that once carried weight in this building evaporating with every paper Elijah laid on the table. Elijah himself stood still, his posture upright, his sack now empty on the counter, the journal and ledgers spread wide like evidence in a trial. And though the guard towered over him, threatening, his calm eyes never wavered, his voice steady and sharp. "You can point a gun at me, you can call me names, you can threaten to drag me out like a criminal, but you cannot erase the truth, not anymore, because it is standing right here in front of you, and every soul in this room knows it." His words rang like steel, firm but not shouted, a calmness that cut deeper than any anger. And for the first time, the guard's hand trembled slightly on the grip of his weapon. The crowd stirred, whispers growing louder, some muttering, "He's right," others fearful. "This could turn violent." A mother pulled her child close, shielding her eyes, while a young man live-streaming whispered to his phone, "He's got a gun on him, folks. This could go bad fast." The nation, through dozens of screens, was now a silent witness. The confrontation spreading beyond the marble lobby into living rooms, offices, and kitchens across America. Richard tried again, his voice thin. "Please, everyone calm down. This will be handled internally. The board will review the documents." But even as he spoke, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes flicked nervously toward the cameras, toward the phones, because he knew the board would have no chance to bury this once it was already public. Mark Donovan snapped his head toward him, spitting out the words, "Don't you dare side with him, Richard. Don't you dare let some con artist shame us. We've worked our whole lives to keep this institution strong, and you're going to throw it all away for the lies of a bitter old man." His rage was palpable, but beneath it was fear. Fear that the foundation of his identity, the authority he had clung to, was collapsing before his eyes. Elijah looked at him, his voice quieter now but cutting deeper. "It is not shame to face the truth. It is shame to keep hiding it. Shame to protect thieves while spitting on the man who built what you guard today. You call me bitter, but what I carry is not bitterness. It is memory, it is history, and if you can't face it, then you are no guard, you are no protector, you are just another wall built to keep the truth out." His words landed heavy, and the murmurs in the crowd swelled, some customers nodding, others clapping softly, their sympathy breaking the silence. The confrontation reached its boiling point when Mark finally drew the gun halfway from its holster, the metallic click echoing like thunder in the quiet lobby, gasps filling the air as people stepped back. A woman screamed, "No, don't shoot him!" and the phones zoomed in, red recording lights glowing. Richard froze, his voice rising in panic. "Mark, put it away! Put it away right now! For God's sake, you'll destroy everything!" But Mark's eyes were wild, darting between Elijah, the customers, the phones, his grip trembling as anger and fear collided. Elijah did not flinch. He took one step closer, his frail body steady, his gaze piercing through the heat of the moment, and his voice, though soft, carried more power than the gun in front of him. "If you pull that trigger, you will not kill me. You will only kill your own soul. You will chain yourself forever to the lies you are trying to protect, and you will prove to the world what I have been saying all along, that a black man's truth is always met with violence. Is that what you want the world to see?" The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of silence that bends the air, the kind that makes time stretch. Mark's hand shook harder, his eyes narrowing, but he could not move. He could not fire, because Elijah's words had stripped him bare, exposing the weakness beneath the fury, slowly, painfully. He slid the gun back into its holster, his breathing heavy, his eyes burning with humiliation, muttering, "You'll regret this, old man. You'll regret ever walking in here." But everyone watching knew the opposite was true. It was Mark who had already lost. Mark who had been exposed. Mark whose threats now looked like the last desperate gasps of a man drowning in truth. Richard, his face ghostly, whispered hoarsely, "It's over. Mark, it's over. The truth is out." Then he turned toward Elijah, his voice faltering. "Mr. Carter, I don't know what will happen next, but I know this. The documents are real, the signatures are real, and we cannot deny you anymore." A cheer, small at first, broke from the corner where a few customers clapped, then spread until applause filled the room, hesitant but growing, not for the manager, not for the guard, but for the frail old man standing tall with nothing but a sack, a ledger, and his unbroken will. Elijah lowered his head slightly, humbled, not triumphant, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who had lived too long in silence. "I did not come for violence. I came for truth. And now that truth is here. It belongs not just to me, but to all of you. Because a lie this big stains everyone who touches it. But once you face it, once you stand with it, the lie dies, and the truth lives." His words resonated through the hall, through the cameras, through the nation. And though the confrontation had not ended the battle, It had ended the silence. The lobby was still trembling from the confrontation. The echoes of Elijah's steady voice and the guards' trembling threats lingering in the air. When the weight of consequence began to fall. Sudden, heavy, undeniable. Richard Harlan. The bank manager, who had once carried himself with polished arrogance, stood slumped at the counter, pale and broken, his authority stripped away in front of his employees, his customers, and now thousands of strangers watching live across the country. He looked at Elijah with a face filled not with hatred, but with defeat. And in that moment, everyone could see the truth. The man who once commanded this branch had lost every shred of credibility, his words, his denials, his rehearsed confidence. All of it had collapsed under the weight of yellowed documents and an old man's unshakable will. But if Richard was broken, Mark Donovan was furious, pacing by the door like a caged animal, his hand still twitching near his holster, his jaw clenched so hard it looked as if he were chewing glass. Yet the crowd no longer feared him. They only watched him with disgust, their eyes saying what their lips dared not, "You are finished, and the whole world knows it." And then, as though the reckoning had chosen its moment, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder until the flashing lights of Atlanta police cut through the glass doors. Their arrival unavoidable, their presence heavy. Phones swung toward the entrance, recording every second, capturing the moment when authority outside would meet the authority inside. Two officers stepped in, firm and professional, hands resting lightly on their belts, their eyes scanning the room and locking on Mark Donovan first. One of them, a black sergeant with sharp eyes and a calm tone, spoke loud enough for all to hear. "We got a call about a disturbance, about a weapon drawn in a bank lobby. Who here is Mark Donovan?" The crowd parted. Every finger, every phone, every camera pointed at the trembling guard. Mark stammered. "I was just trying to protect the bank. This man is a fraud. He's causing a riot." But before he could say more, one customer shouted, "Liar! You nearly shot him." Another chimed in, "We've got it all on video, every second. You pulled that gun." The sergeant didn't waste words. He stepped forward, removed the weapon from Mark's holster, and handed it to his partner. "You'll explain yourself downtown," he said flatly, placing the cuffs on the guard's wrists, his movements precise, his tone sharp, leaving no room for argument. The sight of the once defiant guard being led out in handcuffs sent a shockwave through the lobby. Some customers clapped, others sighed with relief, and a few whispered prayers of thanks. Mark Donovan, red with fury, shouted over his shoulder, "You'll all regret this. The Matthews family will crush you all." But his words fell into silence, drowned by the sound of the doors closing behind him. Attention then turned back to Richard, who still stood frozen, his hands gripping the counter, his body trembling under the weight of his collapse. Elijah fixed his eyes on him, not with hatred, but with something heavier, pity mixed with justice. "Mr. Harlan," Elijah said slowly, his voice deep and resonant, "you had a choice. You could have stood for truth when you first saw it, but instead you mocked me. You tried to silence me. You tried to let the lies live one more day. Now the world has seen your face, and they will not forget." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, only the shallow sound of breath and the faint shake of his head. Because he knew Elijah was right. He knew his career was over, his name already stained. Employees who once looked to him for guidance now turned away, ashamed, unwilling to meet his eyes. Jessica Miller, the young teller who had been the first to step forward and believe Elijah, now stepped into the silence, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Harlan, we can't follow you anymore. This bank needs to face the truth, and if you won't lead us there, then you should step aside." Her words, though soft, carried the weight of finality, and in that moment the transfer of power was visible. From a broken manager to a young woman with courage, Elijah, still standing tall, placed his hand gently on the sack that had carried his life's burden. I did not come here to see men humiliated, but the truth always humbles those who live in lies. The reckoning is not mine to deliver. It belongs to history, to justice. And today, we saw the beginning of it. His eyes swept the room, pausing on Richard, on the empty space where Mark had been dragged out, then on the employees and customers who now looked at him not as a beggar, but as a founder. The police sergeant nodded to Elijah with respect, then addressed the room. These documents will be taken into evidence. There will be an investigation. And I promise you this, if what this man says is true, the law will not ignore it this time. Cheers rose from the back, small but real, and Elijah closed his eyes briefly, as though savoring the first taste of justice after decades of hunger. The reckoning had begun, not only for the men who mocked and threatened him, but for the Matthews family, whose empire trembled now that truth had been dragged into the light. The customers, once skeptical, now walked out with their phones in hand, their videos already viral, the story spreading faster than any press release could contain. And as Elijah stood in that lobby, frail yet unbowed, he knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Courts, lawsuits, resistance from the powerful. But for the first time in 70 years, he was no longer alone. The weeks that followed the confrontation at First Union Bank shook Atlanta to its core, and the ripples spread far beyond one branch. For Elijah Carter's truth had traveled faster than anyone could stop it, carried through live streams, news reports, and countless retellings that captured the image of an old man with a sack standing tall against decades of erasure. Within days, the Matthews family, long untouchable in the world of finance, found themselves under siege from lawsuits, federal inquiries, and the piercing judgment of public opinion. Reporters dug into archives, uncovering traces of Elijah's name that had been buried, and when the state records office admitted that documents from the 1950s had indeed been misplaced in ways that could not be explained, the illusion of the Matthews dynasty began to crumble. Richard Harlan was dismissed quietly, but nothing could silence the humiliation of his downfall, his face captured on video as the man who tried to deny history until it broke him. Mark Donovan fared even worse, indicted on charges of assault and misconduct, his rage and arrogance replayed in clips across the internet as a warning of what blind loyalty to lies can cost. Yet for Elijah, the reckoning was not measured in headlines or arrests, but in something deeper, the quiet recognition that his life's truth was finally seen, finally acknowledged after 70 years of silence. When he walked through his neighborhood in Atlanta, strangers now stopped him with tears in their eyes, shaking his hand, thanking him for his courage, telling him their grandparents had been denied loans too, telling him that his fight was their fight. For the first time in his long life, Elijah felt not invisible, not dismissed, but honored. The bank itself could not remain untouched, under pressure from regulators and the weight of public outrage. First Union's board of directors was forced to hold an emergency meeting, and when Elijah, frail but resolute, walked into that room with his sack at his side, the silence was telling. No one laughed, no one smirked, no one dared to dismiss him. He placed the ledger and the deed on the table, his hands steady, and spoke with calm authority. This bank was built on my sweat and my savings. It grew fat on lies. But now the truth is here, and you must decide whether you will keep hiding in shame or face the history that gave you your power. The board members, many of them wealthy heirs of families who had benefited from that stolen history, shifted uncomfortably, but the cameras outside, the reporters at the door, and the weight of Elijah's evidence left them no escape. They offered a settlement, money they thought would appease him, but Elijah shook his head. This is not about my pocket. This is about justice, This bank must admit its past, return what was taken, and make right what it can. And for the first time in its history, the Matthews family's institution was forced to issue a public statement acknowledging that Elijah Carter, a black man erased by greed and prejudice, had in fact been the rightful founder of the bank in 1952. The legacy of that moment spread far beyond Atlanta. Universities invited Elijah to speak. Civil rights organizations called him a living monument, and younger generations saw in him a reminder that truth, though buried, will rise if carried with patience and faith. Yet Elijah remained humble, still living in the same modest house, still walking with the same worn shoes, still carrying the same sack, not as a burden anymore, but as a symbol, proof that memory and persistence are stronger than any erasure. When asked by a reporter what justice meant to him now, he paused, his eyes glistening, and said softly, "Justice is when a man can die knowing he was not invisible." Those words, simple yet powerful, were printed in headlines across the country, quoted in sermons, shared in classrooms, and repeated in homes where people had long felt the sting of silence. And so the legacy of Elijah Carter was written not only in ledgers and court rulings, but in the hearts of people who saw in his fight a mirror of their own. The Matthews name, once synonymous with power, became a cautionary tale, whispered with shame instead of pride. The bank itself, under new leadership, launched initiatives for minority-owned businesses, scholarships for students of color, and community programs that finally began to reflect the vision Elijah had held in his heart 70 years before. But the true victory was not in programs or policies. It was in the sight of one old man walking down the street with his head held high, greeted not with mockery, but with respect. His story no longer buried but lifted as part of the American memory. For the people who had once laughed at him, there was regret. For the ones who had believed him, there was hope. And for Elijah himself, there was peace. The peace of knowing that though justice had come late, it had come. His sack was lighter now, his burden shared by many, and in his final years he could finally rest, not as a forgotten man, but as the founder he had always been. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe so you never miss the next story of truth and justice. Your support keeps these voices alive.